Welcome to the Food Fraud video series offered by Michigan State University's Food Fraud Initiative. I am Dr. John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative. I am also an assistant professor faculty member at Michigan State. This is video 11 on enterprise risk management in Module 10, Risk. Let's begin. First off, this is an overview that was presented originally in our executive education series here at Michigan State, offered in September 2015. Let's first review why we're conducting risk assessments and how we will then apply enterprise risk management. At the very core of the food fraud programs and prevention plans is the fraud opportunity. This is based on crime science, specifically situational crime prevention and routine activities theory. It's called sometimes the chemistry of the crime. But a key is we look at the fraud opportunity itself and try to reduce it. We're trying first to detect fraud. We must detect it so we can know if it does occur or not, and define when it does. Then we deter. Once we know how and why bad guys are attacking, we can put countermeasures or systems in place to deter that specific type of activity. Finally, prevention. Prevention is the goal. If we only detect product but don't focus on prevention, all we will do is catch the product. The goal is not to catch food fraud. The goal is to prevent it in the first place, to create a situation where a company is a harder target, and so bad guys decide that there is a lower fraud opportunity. One way that we assess the fraud opportunity to apply resources is to conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment. And the key is that there's many types of food fraud, and one vulnerability assessment doesn't necessarily cover all types of food fraud efficiently. One is adulterant substances. This is the main type of enterprise risk or business risk, whether it's public health or economic risk. But there's also others that are maybe not as clearly defined as searching for a substance, such as tampering. Tampering could be genuine product, genuine packaging that's been opened and refilled, or date code tampering. In the event of date code tampering, both the product itself and the package would both be genuine. So any testing or evaluation we do in the area of food authenticity testing or testing for those adulterant substances would not tell us that there has been fraud conducted. But once fraud's conducted, such as date code tampering, that could lead to a recall. It could also be expired goods, and that could be a public health threat. So it's very important to look at each type of food fraud vulnerability under that assessment. Also would be theft, such as cargo theft or smaller scale theft. Then overruns. This is production that's unauthorized, and since it's unauthorized, it would be outside of our understanding and tracking systems for both traceability or for good manufacturing practices. And then diversion or gray market product. This is product intended for one market sold in another. When that occurs, there's a lack of transparency in the supply chain and a lack of understanding of how that product was handled. And finally, our counterfeits. This is intellectual property rights violations such as trademark and copyright. This is where all the aspects of the product, package, system are all fraudulent. When we conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment, it ends up with a rank. So in this case, let's say it's high. Well, what do we do with that? With food safety, those limits are set often by regulations or some other level of internal assessment of what is acceptable or not. In the case of food fraud, to start, this is an emerging risk that's very different. And each type of food fraud has a very different type of assessment or type of impact on the organization, especially because most types of food fraud do not have a public health threat. Most of the food safety and food risk systems that are in place are based on assessing a risk and a public health risk or a hazard. So we have this challenge of it's a high food fraud vulnerability, but what do we do about that? How do we figure out what's the appropriate response for an enterprise? Enterprise risk management. This is not a new concept, and we'll cover this in the next slides. But a key is that this risk then gets calibrated with all other risks inside the organization. This is a broad concept that's widely adopted, and there's a lot of best practices and training that can go on to really understand how to apply it. And it's an excellent resource to make decisions for food fraud countermeasures and systems. To back up and explain ERM and the new concept of Chief Risk Officer, we'll cover a few points. And the key is that ERM and CROs are becoming a lot more common. They might not be formal in that name within a company, but oftentimes they are. or they're applying ERM systems and processes, but they might call it something else within your enterprise. A key is that the CRO, who often reports up through the chief financial officer, they're expanding their focus to all hazards within their structure. Every type of risk that occurs within a company has a place within the enterprise risk management system. And this is key because there may be 13 different operating companies, and each operating company may have a very low risk for one type of activity. But across all of them, there may be a multiplier effect that leads to the enterprise being very much at risk. So what we need to do as food professionals under here, food safety professionals, is understand and speak the language of risk. Because there are systems in place, if we speak the language of risk and present our concepts and our assessments, such as our food fraud vulnerability assessment, in terms of ERM, then that's a language that those financial analysts can understand and they can use in their current systems. Use a risk matrix and risk summing. These are two concepts we'll show later as well. But risk matrix is a central matrix that they do use across your organization, and risk summing is looking at all risks coming together. This also leads to something called a risk appetite, which would be the amount of risk your enterprise is willing to take. And the key is we should focus on strategic nature, the strategic nature of risk, both pro and con. There's opportunity, and many times where there are unknowns, there are risks. And so a business unit, an operating company, may decide to not take an action because the risk is unknown. And where we reduce those unknowns, we reduce the risks as well. So there may be something that seems like a very risky behavior, but we may be able to put a very simple countermeasure in place that may cost something, but there might be a net benefit, such as a small cost for testing and a great benefit of reduced cost of goods. Enterprise risk management in the continuum from operational risk. So a key is operational risk is something that we really more clearly understand in the operations side, such as manufacturing or plant or in food safety. This is really, operational risk is really more like quality control because we're managing the negative impact only. We're trying to raise the product to a certain level of quality. This is operational risk. It's tactical, it's quantitative, and the way that we look at it is return on investment. What we mean by tactical is something that really does happen within the operation, within a certain smaller facility. And it's quantitative. We can assess it, we can measure it, we can measure every product that was produced in a plant during whatever time period a day. And then if we understand the anomalies and the problems, and we can clearly define how much that cost us, we can also then look at very clearly what a solution or countermeasure would cost. And in that sense, we can do a very clear accounting return on investment. That's a very specific function that accountants conduct. On the other side is enterprise risk. This is broader. This is all risks across the enterprise, not just within our certain operations. This is a strategic risk. It's qualitative, and we focus on vulnerability instead of risk. And this is real key because strategic being that it may be very hard to measure things like lost sales or brand equity or market capitalization loss, but those are very strategic to the enterprise. Stock prices in after some major incidents can go down drastically. It's qualitative because if one of these events, it's really hard for us to even estimate what the cost of a shutdown due to a recall would cost if the entire company was shut down. If maybe there's a certain type of activity that occurs that brings into question every product that the company makes, not just one specific product line. And this is where it leads to vulnerability rather than specifically analyzing a very statistics and probability based risk. Vulnerability is something that may never have occurred before, and if it does occur, may never occur again, but by nature of the operation, the business, you are vulnerable. To give you a few examples, on one side is metal shavings. You could do a assessment of every product that came out of your plant during whatever time period a day. And if you had a very precise metal detector that you brought in, you'd be able to identify exactly what went wrong. And so you could also identify how much product over a course of time you've had to destroy or the losses of production time based on that problem. And you could then clearly also analyze how much it would cost to put countermeasures in place. You could measure 100% of all the production, and you would be able to define very quantitatively the risk and the return on investment. In the middle of something like shoplifting, this is a lot harder to really assess because the analysis is less quantitative. it's less analytical. We don't have as pure numbers to analyze. What I mean by that is you might know exactly how much product you think should be in the store, and you could do an inventory of the store and you would know exactly what's in the store. What you wouldn't know is exactly why that product is not in the store. Was it damaged goods that weren't recorded? Was it product that was never received? Was it product that was truly shoplifted? So there's more variability in that analysis of the anomaly. Finally, counterfeiting. This is intellectual property rights counterfeiting, trademark violations. It's completely fake product that's been outside your system for the entire time. We have no way to really analyze and assess and count all the counterfeit product in the world. It would be every corner of the world to try to measure that. That would be really, really challenging. It's also very challenging, if not impossible, to estimate how much you actually lost, because maybe people tried your product and didn't like it, and then they stopped buying it for the rest of their lives. So this is a lot softer, but it is a very strategic risk, because entering a new market, if counterfeits are prevalent in the market, then consumers may not like your product because they may think that they're consuming the genuine product. It's qualitative because we don't have real hard numbers. We know it really is a risk, but we don't have actual analytical assessments of that risk. And this is where we look at vulnerability. And at the very high levels, this vulnerability is known and understood. And we can then, from our food safety and food fraud risks, we can enter into that analysis and that system. So ERM is based on COSO accounting principles, and this is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway. So this is a group that organized to create common risk assessment accounting, managerial accounting operations. It's a group of the 5 largest financial and managerial accounting associations, and they created this to create a common language across companies. And a couple things that it's really looking to do is enhancing risk response decisions. So when you have a risk, you have a system, a way to analyze those risks compared to all other risks. And if you look at the box on the right, you can see a lot of things that we know and we can use. Risk assessment is on there. And then across the top, you see operations, reporting, and compliance. There's already concepts here where we can enter in our information. This also then reduces the operational surprises and losses, because if you're looking at all risks across an organization, you have a better assessment of those risks and a better understanding of the overall risk profile of a company. And so even if those risks are very qualitative, then they can still be assessed generally to look at that risk. Then identifying and managing multiple and cross-enterprise risks. This is a real key, because there's many of these risks that are across an organization or across different operating companies, and there hasn't been a way to calibrate all those risks. And under COSO and other the ERM principles, there is. Seizing opportunities. I mentioned earlier, where there are unknowns, there are risks. And many times we do not take risks when there's just too many unknowns. So parts of an organization or an operating company may have actually been more conservative than the enterprise would have liked them to be. But if we have a way for them to look at those risks more broadly, and then maybe there will be fewer unknowns, and then they can take more risks. They can take calculated risks, or maybe they can feel more comfortable investing in additional countermeasures or different ways to transfer risk, and then maybe that business can have a higher return because they're able to comfortably and reasonably take higher risks. Finally, improving the deployment of capital. So this is looking at and understanding that there's a finite amount of financial resource for a company, and this is a system to look at all risks across the enterprise to understand where there is the most efficient deployment of capital. So to look at risk analysis, we think we know risk analysis, but there's a lot of parts of it that we probably don't apply as food safety professionals. First off, the risk assessment and hazard identification. This is very well known to us in food safety. A key with enterprise risk management is that every risk goes into that risk assessment. There may be risks that very quickly are identified as risks that are not to be addressed yet, but the key is that they're in the system. If there are dynamics in the marketplace that change, world events that change, then those risks are already in there, and if they're properly entered, then we'll already know what occurs, and we can quickly then analyze for increased vulnerability of an enterprise. That's under the risk assessment, and that's what we've been doing with vulnerability assessments as well. And then there's risk management. This is once there's a decision made that you must address a risk, it needs to be managed, mitigated, or prevented. And this is something also that we're very comfortable with once decisions are made. One thing that's not real clear for us from the food safety standpoint is risk communication. We're used to situations where a certain measure of how many colony forming units of something is bad, that government regulation defines an acceptable level. So this is a real finite level of acceptable or unacceptable. With many risks across the organization, they're not very clearly defined. And with food fraud at the start anyway here, they're not very clearly defined. So we need to be better at risk communication. And partially this is, as we mentioned before, understanding and speaking the language of risk. And so this is what we're doing in our communication of taking that vulnerability assessment, such as a high result, and then trying to equate it into the business enterprise risk concepts. On the right, you'll see this is a risk matrix that's common for a type of corporation. And you'll see on one upper corner is red. That's in the unacceptable range. Those risks must be mitigated or prevented and brought back down into the yellow or the green. And at the bottom are risks that are retained because they're lower level risks that are a part of just doing business. And the yellow region is often called an actively monitor area. There's a risk threshold here. Now this risk threshold might not be very clearly defined, at least not for us in food safety, which is why we need to then expand our perspective and try to figure out where some of these emerging risks fit on that risk threshold. And then risk mitigation. At the end of all this management is to go through and really pick the activities that will be new activities and projects, either systems or countermeasures. So when we look at different risks, different types of risks fit on the hierarchy in a certain way. So some are high and some are low. Probably there's many of these food fraud risks that will be very, very low, that very low on probability and very low on severity. But a key is that when we look at our risks, we try to plot them, and then we can go to the chief risk officer or CFO and calibrate whether our assessment is correct in their view. And the key is we're trying to get those risks from the red zone down to at least the yellow, but into the green. We'll give you an example of some of the complexity of this type of risk assessment. First off is metal shavings that we mentioned. Let's say that costs us $4 million. We know that we have, on average, every year, losses of $4 million because we find metal detectors or because we find metal in our product. Let's say that we think that the countermeasures will cost $1 million. Whether this is changing equipment from something that's metal, that the shavings would fall off, going to plastic, or some type of advanced detection system. If we put those things in place, we're pretty darn sure that we're going to eliminate them. And the key with metal shavings, we know exactly what's going on, we know exactly where it's going wrong, we know how we're going to measure that product, how we're going to improve it, and how we're going to measure success. So that's very clear. That's the gold standard for any type of risk assessment and countermeasures. This is something that's an easy decision for a financial officer. Shoplifting, this is one again that was a little bit softer. So it costs us a lot more, and the response to countermeasures would also cost a lot more. And since we don't know exactly why it occurs or how it occurs, we also then don't know exactly how to measure it or measure success. So we're pretty darn sure if we put a certain system in place, it might lower it, but we might not be exactly sure of how far it goes down. So in this case, if it's a general vulnerability, this still may be a reasonable investment, and it might be good enough for that decision-making process. With product counterfeiting, product fraud, or food fraud, many times it's clearly understood that this is a huge problem. And so let's say it's a $750 million potential vulnerability for a company. The problem is that any countermeasure is probably going to be costly, at least for this mass scale to deal with everything. And since we don't have a real good analytical quantitative assessment of the risk, we also don't know exactly how to measure success. So the problem we have here in this area when dealing with product fraud is that there's a big unknown when it comes to the countermeasures and measuring success. This is why there's such a challenge. This is why going to enterprise risk management is so important, because if everything was like metal shavings on the left, we could use standard accounting practices of return on investment, very specific analysis to understand if this is a good payback. But with product counterfeiting, product fraud, food fraud, this is something that's a lot more soft. Again, it's more strategic, it's qualitative, and it's really about vulnerability. And this is why enterprise risk management is such an important concept for us to use here. So, following and concluding on enterprise risk management, governance and continual evaluation. What we need to do is to speak the language of ERM. It's not real difficult. Once we start to talk to the financial folks, we start to understand how they use ERM, what type of risk assessments they conduct, and then we can understand what type of information they need. We need to calibrate the food risk with all other food risks and all the other competing resource allocation decisions. So this is not just high is bad. It's looking at high, how bad is high? And what are other things we could do? How much of a response should you take for that? And this is where ERM will help us analyze this risk with all other competing resource allocation decisions. We must keep evaluating. The risk appetite and food fraud vulnerability are in a state of flux. The enterprise risk appetite constantly fluctuates. The market changes up and down. And the same with food fraud. As new things occur in the marketplace, as suppliers shift or change and commodity prices change, food fraud constantly fluxes. So we need to be analyzing our own risk appetite, which they do look at and manage from the CRO standpoint, and we need to look at food fraud. We need to calibrate those two as well, because at some point some of the risks may become unacceptable. We need to keep selling loss prevention to management. This is loss prevention or fraud and the issue of what we're doing, the countermeasures to management. And we do this by continual case studies of the competitors. You may have a very low fraud opportunity because you have a certain, maybe a proprietary supply chain, but there may be inherent risk in the marketplace. And again, finally, to consider this like a disease in remission. You need to continually monitor it, even if it's a vulnerability that is low and you seem to have it under control. With that, I'll say thank you. For more information, please see our website at www.foodfraud.msu.edu. Have a great day.